Hi, this is Bible Basics number 10, and I've been talking to you about different issues associated with the Bible we have and looking at some very fundamental but very important issues focused around the table of contents, because that tells us what's in the Bible. And we talked about the difference between Holy Bible, and we talked about the Old Testament and the New Testament. And we've given a fairly thorough view of what we have, especially here in the New Testament. We haven't spent that much time talking about the Old, because we're examining the Bible as a historical document. I think it's important for all of us to come to the Bible first and foremost as a historical text and let it speak for itself like we would any historical text. If we do, I believe that it presents a very convincing case for the life of Jesus Christ, the kind of things he did and taught. He did miracles. He taught about God. And everything he did was a fulfillment of what had been written in the Old Testament scriptures. And if you do that and you let it speak, then you will come to see the Bible as more than just a book, more than just a reliable historical book, but then you will become to see it as the Word of God. Because if Jesus really lived and did and said the things that the New Testament reports that he did, and he was really raised from the dead, and it was really all according to what had been prophesied in the Old Testament, that there can be no denying that Jesus Christ is of God, and that we can listen to him. And he clearly believed that the Old Testament scriptures were the Word of God, and the New Testament comes from the apostles that he sent. He was sent by God. So the net of all that, without going into all the detail, is that the Bible is the Word of God. But we don't come to it initially as the Word of God. If we did that, if we came to it as the Word of God and then believe it's the Word of God, then someone could rightly ask us, well, then how do you know it's the Word of God? You're just kind of reasoning in a circle. You're taking it as a given or a granted that the Bible is the Word of God, but how do you get to that conclusion? Now, you might say, well, I believe my father, he taught me this, and I trust him, and he would not lie to me. But then that means somebody would need to think, well, okay, well, how did your father come to that conviction? And you've got to trace it back. Well, the simpler and more straightforward way to approach it is to do what I'm doing with you, which is presenting you the Bible as something that's historically reliable, that you can tell where it came from, and then you can read it and let it speak for itself, and you can come to your own convictions about it. And then you can know that it's the Word of God because you have been yourself convinced that it is and live according to it. Well, I'm going to jump ahead. The Old Testament was written, Moses began writing, I'm going to speak in rough numbers just to make the numbers easier to remember. Moses began writing the first books of the Bible around 1500 BC. And the last books of the Old Testament were written around 500 BC, probably closer to 400, but you get the idea. Roughly over a little more than 1,000-year period, the Old Testament was written. And then there was roughly about a 400 to 500 period of time of silence, so to speak, that there were no biblical texts written until the time of Jesus. Jesus lived in the first century. His apostles were part of his generation, and they wrote their texts, the 27 texts we call the New Testament. And then they had gone throughout the world just as Jesus had instructed them to. And over the period of the next few centuries, the writings that they left were preserved, gathered and collected together in various churches. And once book technology got to the point that a complete Bible could be produced, which was around the 4th century, then we had the Bible finalized, and it's been finalized ever since. So that was in the 4th and 5th century, so we can say that ends at, say, the year 500. So then you take the next period, say 500 to 1500, that's called the Middle Ages. And after that, in the 16th century, comes the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. And out of that comes the Enlightenment. And we're going to jump ahead to that period now, because it was in that period the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, all those different periods were, roughly, they were post-Middle Ages, and the Reformation was either concurrent or preceded those things. And we're going to pick it up, say, for the last 300, 400, 500 years. Now, we're going to jump ahead. We've been talking mainly about that period from when Jesus was born till roughly 4th or 5th century. Now we're going to talk about the last few centuries, last 2 or 3 centuries, maybe 4. And the title of this is Modern Biblical Scholarship. In prior ages, scholarship regarding the Bible was a part of the church structure. Like when we talked in the Old Testament, when we talked about the New Testament being formed, and we talked about scholars such as Augustine or Jerome or Athanasius or Eusebius, or just different ones, Tertullian, Origen. All these men were scholars, but they were also, for the most part, churchmen. They were usually bishops, head of the church in a given city or region. But in the post-Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment age, higher education and church were separated. We see this sort of happening in colonial America. The original Ivy League schools like Harvard, Yale, Princeton were originally started to educate ministers. They were, that was their focus. And it was only later on that they became secular institutions, divorced and separated from the church and from religion. And this period is very distinct. And the church and higher education became completely separated from one another. And there are still some church-supported or church-connected colleges and seminaries and so forth, but the main bulk of the colleges and universities and seminaries and such became separated from church. And so you have what's called the church and then what's called the academy. The church and the academy became separate. And one of the things we're going to see in modern biblical scholarship is it came to take positions very different from the church's take on things. And I'll explain to you what those are as we go through this. The church became secular the academy became secular because the scientific academy and all the other parts of the higher education system became secular. And that was driven a great deal by Charles Darwin and his book, his seminal book on evolution. Prior to him, there was I think he was a geologist. His name was James Lyell. And he led a movement to sort of take faith out of the academic study of the Bible. They wanted that to be separate. And one of the main ways they did that was through a methodology called uniformitarianism, which is kind of a mouthful. But I believe the opposing term was catastrophism. Well, to break those down, for centuries, people who studied these things, history, whether it be biblical history or any other history, at least in Western civilization, looked at the flood of Noah as sort of a defining event in the ancient age, before or after creation. And the Charles Lyell and his associates wanted to sort of get out, take Moses' view out, because Moses was the one telling about creation. There weren't secular historians back when the world was formed, so there were none of them around to document it. And the the main story we have from creation came from Moses. Now, likely he had received it by tradition, but after a while, oral tradition gets lost, and what remains is what's written down. So Lyell wanted to get that out. So this uniformitarianism was a methodology which said we assume that all the processes we observe in nature have always been at work. Just go back into the infinite past, and they always work. And so what that meant was that the world was much, much older than anybody thought. And that opened the door for Charles Darwin to come along with the theory of evolution, because with all that time, if you've given up, if you want to say, well, it requires faith to believe in the creation that Moses described, and we want to have a robust historical methodology which doesn't depend on faith, which deals with what you can't see or hear or taste or touch. So we want to strip out of our historical studies that which has to do with faith. And so that meant you had to have some other explanation for how the world got to the way it is in the present. And Charles Darwin came along and said, okay, that big gap of time, these are my words, not his, that big gap of time that Charles Lyell created for us, where somehow this all happened, I've got a theory about how that we can fill that gap with an explanation. And it was off to the races after that. And basically all of formal education, formal higher education, turned to that explanation of things. But because the academy was separate from the church was insulated. People in the pews were insulated somewhat from this change. And sometimes the ministers would go to these schools, but they wouldn't come back and teach what they had been taught, because they wouldn't be able to hold a congregation. The congregation would just run away, saying, how can you be up there preaching the Bible and you don't even believe the Bible? And truly that was the big mistake of historical or of biblical scholarship, was that they said you can no longer involve faith. Well, that's just pure foolishness. Jesus believed in creation. He believed in Moses' account of creation. He believed in Moses' writings. And if we trust him, then we trust his view of things. And so for me, it's a simple matter to say that, well, I know that Moses' account is true. I could examine it and come to believe it's true for a lot of other ways, but for me, the simplest and most assuring way is to believe what Jesus believed about creation. That's what I want to believe. I want to believe what he believed. And to rule that out just sorts of sets you up for not understanding, and even worse, to make you think you're smart for not understanding. Like it says in Romans, they professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. And so that's really what modern biblical scholarship has become on fundamental issues, is they've just become foolish. And so as a result, they don't believe what the ancients, they don't rely on what the ancient academic sources said about who wrote the various books of the New Testament. And because they don't believe that, they can't be sure that they have reliable historical information about Jesus. And because of that, they can't be sure that they're even, well, they can be sure there's a historical Jesus. They haven't gone so far as, there's really only nutcases on the internet who go so far as to say there wasn't a historical Jesus. But they can hardly agree on anything that he actually said. And I'm going to spend more time on this, but today I just wanted to introduce the idea of modern biblical scholarship, and that it has parted company with the historical explanations. It has elevated itself as an authority above the Bible. Prior to the Enlightenment, academics who study the Bible tend to believe that they were studying the Word of God, and they read it accordingly. It didn't mean that they were unscientific. The leaders of the first wave of the scientific revolution were very committed Christian men, Isaac Newton, Johannes Kepler. It was only in the second wave of the scientific revolution that science became secularized. God was driven out, and naturalism was embraced. Well, have to end this now, but we'll spend more time on it next time. And this has just been an introduction to modern biblical scholarship, such as it is.